Good morning. I am really pleased to be here with you all. It's great to see so many people out in the audience and ready to discuss the important matters we have before us. Now that Sandy has given us our charge, in short, the Scrooge problem, I will just tell you that I'm delighted to be here and to be moderating this session. We had some really exciting exchanges last night over dinner, and I only wish that I had been able to take notes because there was so much to think about and actually a few great phrases to remember. But today I can take notes, and so can all of you. And I hope that people will do that because we are going to be addressing some gaping problems in our society. Problems that are with us because our forebears never squarely faced the problems that have snowballed into the ones that we face now. And that's why I'm so pleased to be moderating a panel that cuts to the heart of so many of the crucial issues that have put our nation, and in fact our world, in the crisis we can all see that we are in now. Because there has been a terrible default of the left that has created an opening on the right for the likes of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, and more. Even as the failure of the center to take seriously the damage neoliberalism has wrought has enabled the horrors we are seeing more of in our own country, most obviously since Charlottesville, but also now in Europe. In the historic birthplace of Nazism in Austria, we now see the right having new electoral success. So the stakes are very high on the kinds of issues we're talking about today, and I hope that people will give their full attention to these discussions and really engage, and that also means turning off your phones. Anyway, I have also really been looking forward to this session because I heard Richard Reeves speaking about his book on NPR and read about his revelatory and crucial and provocative work, provocative in the best way, and so I welcomed the book for two reasons. One of which is intellectual, and the other is personal. So before I introduce our two speakers, I want to elaborate on both of those for a moment, because I think they're quite relevant. Richard Reeves' arguments in The Dream Hoarders, which he'll talk to you more about in a minute, came to me at a perfect time. As Sandy mentioned, I had just finished my own book about the ideas that are guiding the donor network built by Charles Koch in an effort to radically rewrite the rules of governance in our society and, in fact, in others. And, in fact, to rewrite the Constitution itself in a push to hold a constitutional convention to rewrite the rules of our society to essentially protect capitalism of the variant that Koch and his fellow donors believe in from democracy. And that's an important and underreported story, if I do say so myself, but it is not the only story or the whole story. And what enables that plutocratic power grab, one could say, is the knowledge of its architects that so many of us are complicit with some of its premises. This hit me full force the first time I heard Richard Reeves talking about his crucial new book on the radio. Has anyone in this room not talked with parents who thought that their own children were too special to attend public schools with their peers? I doubt it. I was just in Cambridge where some parents were joking about their child having a heart set on attending a private middle school that would cost $50,000 a year. A middle school. Something is happening in our culture that we need to talk about. Now, if you think I'm too moralistic in raising this, let me start with a confession. That's the personal part. I am the product of dream hoarding parents. Like other dream hoarding parents, my parents, I don't believe, ever imagined that they were hurting others, just helping their own children. But we moved around a lot. My father worked for a company that transferred him frequently. And they always said they were looking for good schools. They wanted to go to the communities with the best schools. And I got those best schools, but they happened to be in communities that were overwhelmingly white, again and again and again and again. But my story, I just put it out there because I think we can all start some truth-telling about these issues if we want to see the cultural change we need to get the policy change we want. My story is really just a segue to what I believe is one of the most important books of our time, and to a conversation about it with the author and an equally incisive commentator. So I am eager to shut up and introduce our two featured speakers in this session. Richard Reeves will be giving you an introductory version of this book that all Americans, or at least all academics and others in the top 20%, much as no one owns that title, need to read. A book with the spot-on title, Dream Hoarders, how the American upper middle class is leaving everyone else in the dust, why that is a problem, and what to do about it. Before that, he wrote several other important books and did all kinds of cool and important stuff you can see in his bio or ask him about at lunch or later. But this morning, we're really here to talk about dream hoarding and why it is so devastating for the 80% of children whose parents don't have the wherewithal to do it. Richard is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where he is co-director of the Center on Children and Families. And he has also been named one of the Politico 50 for policy innovation for 2017. After Richard presents, Gillian White, senior associate editor at The Atlantic, will comment and lay out some themes for further consideration in our discussion. Among her many incisive articles are a few that seem highly relevant to today's conversation, including, when should companies dump white supremacist customers? Another one, what is Dodd-Frank and why does Trump want to repeal it? Ms. White, who's an alumna of Columbia and the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, has been on the political economy and privilege beat for some time at Kiplinger and Bloomberg before The Atlantic. And at The Atlantic, she is reporting on what they're calling the next economy. And we can only hope that that next economy will be better for those excluded by the dream hoarders than the present one. Do you guys want to come up now? Great.
Thank you, Nancy.
You're welcome.
Shall I speak from here, or? I think I probably will. I have a few slides. I'm a Brookings scholar, and we get anxious if we don't have slides. So I brought slides. So my plan is to just briefly outline the argument of the book, and then look forward to Gillian's responses and yours. So thank you, Nancy, for that introduction. I've never had my work described as cool before. Literally never. And also to Sandy and his team for putting this together. And I'd like to congratulate the Roosevelt Institute team for their book, which I think is an incredibly important book on race and on the hidden rules, both the formal and informal forms of regulation by which racial stratification continues. I'm also grateful that you mentioned the Politico Top 50 award, because it gives me a chance to say that I'm not the only person in the room who was named one of the Politico Top 50, because Sandy and Derek also shared a spot on that list as well. So congratulations to them. And I must say that in previous years, I've always looked at the Politico 50 list with disdain. I've thought it was entirely subjective, vapid, clickbait nonsense with no connection to the real world. But I must say, this year, I don't know if Sandy and Derek, they really nailed it. And also very glad of the way Sandy opened with stratification, because I wish I'd thought of this before. In a way, my book is an attempt to talk less about inequality than stratification. And social scientists used to actually study stratification quite a lot. If you look back in the literature, there are many books with that word in the title, but actually many fewer now. And so the inequality debate has to some extent overtaken the stratification debate. But I think stratification, in the sense of enduring inequality, to use Charles Tilly's phrase, is actually in some ways a bigger problem than inequality at any particular moment. So that's what my book is about. I have to start with a tiny bit of personal stuff, because first of all, my book gets real personal real quick. As Nancy's already identified, I haven't done an event where it hasn't gotten personal. And that's inevitable, and actually that's part of the point of the book, is actually to make inequality more personal, is to make it more of an intimate issue. I think inequality is quite intimate. And I think also the second book you're going to hear about today speaks to that very strongly. This is not just an abstract thing. But it should be obvious by now that I'm not from here. And by here, I don't just mean Raleigh-Durham. I'm not from the US, I'm from the UK. In October of last year, I actually became a US citizen. So I am now a US citizen. I actually became a US citizen on the very last day in my state, Maryland, that you could become a citizen and register to vote. And in fact, it was the last ceremony of that day. So I was among the last 53 people in Maryland that became citizens and were able to vote. And every single one of us trooped from picking up our certificate of naturalization to the Women's League of Voters in order to vote. 53 people from 47 different countries. Very big deal for me, but a very much bigger deal for most of the people in the room, including the woman next to me in tears holding her child who was from Afghanistan. And I don't know has anyone been part of or attended a citizenship ceremony? Hands up who's kind of been to one. It's hard to forget, isn't it? And they name the country, and you stand up for your country when they name it, and you see people from all around the world, and every single one of us went to vote. It's an incredibly moving experience, and it feels particularly pertinent to mention that now. So I did register to vote, and I voted. In fact, I voted both in the US presidential election and by postal vote. I voted in the Brexit EU referendum in the UK. So it was a banner year for me, politically. I have a French friend who texted me and said, "Do not take French citizenship," which I didn't. And Macron won. Could just be coincidence. And I'm going to. Part of the reason why I mention the fact that I'm British is because the story of the book is partly about a comparison between the British and the American class system. And to cut straight to the chase, in a way, the book is really about my belief that the American class system operates more ruthlessly, efficiently than the British one I left behind. But it does so under a veneer of meritocratic classlessness. Mm-hmm. And I never thought I would say this, but I miss the class consciousness of my old country, because at least with class consciousness, you create some space to try and do something about it. Or as I put it in a piece I wrote for the Times when my book came out, at least in the UK, posh people have the decency to feel guilty. And although it sort of sounds like it is a joke, but it's also kind of serious, because it's like, actually, that does create some space. Now, I think there are two reasons why we don't talk as much about class in the US, one good, one bad. The bad one I've mentioned, which is the myth of meritocracy, which I'm going to talk a bit more about. And the good reason is race, and the salience of racial stratification and racial inequality in the US. That is a good reason why there's been more attention paid to racial inequality than class inequality in the US. However, I do think we need to think of them together. And although I've done a lot of work on race, this book is almost entirely about class. I think we'll probably get into some of the ways in which it overlaps with race. And as Nancy's already kicked us off, this does become a bit of a class confessional sometimes, as the people start thinking about, well, in what ways am I a dream hoarder, etc. So I would encourage you, within the confines of these walls and on video, to confess your own dream hoarding tendencies. Or indeed the times that you've kind of resisted it. So with that, I'm just going to very quickly go through some of these slides. I'm going to skip through it because I really want to have some time for the conversation. Who remembers, so some young people in the audience, so just in case, this is Barack Obama, who's the 44th president of the United States. Doesn't it feel like a long time ago? And I opened the book with a story about Barack Obama. In January of 2015, he became the first president in living memory to ask his own party to vote against an element in his own budget before it even got to Congress. And he did so under pressure, not from the other side, but from his own party. And that was the moment I decided I had to write the book. It was the illuminating moment for me. And I'm just going to briefly tell that story and then show a few more slides. So he is on Air Force One. He's just produced his budget. He's flying from India to Saudi Arabia. And there's a row. There's a huge argument happening in the press and his own party. He is with Nancy Pelosi. That's a terrible picture. I apologize. Just scraped these off the internet. So Nancy Pelosi, she talks to him and she persuades him he needs to change his mind about this. Why does she do that? She has a phone call. She gets a phone call. From who? From, this doesn't work, Chris Van Hollen, who at the time was my congressman, is now the junior senator for Maryland. Chris calls Nancy and says, "Hey, Nancy, we have to kill this idea." And she says, "Okay, fine, I'm on Air Force One. I'll just walk up and talk to the president." He's in his office. There's a knock at the door. This is based on real events, so I obviously don't know exactly what happened. "Hi, come in." "Hi, it's Nancy." For some reason, I'm wearing my name. Again, I apologize for the, hey, come in, what's up? "Well, you have to kill this idea, this tax idea you've had. It's a terrible idea. I've spoken to Chris. Our mailboxes are filling up. You can't do it. You'll have to reverse course. He says, OK, I'll discuss it with my senior advisors. Goes back to his office, calls the White House, says, hello, White House, it's the president. I don't really know how it works, but something like that. We have to change our mind. The very next day, his spokesman stands up and announces the end of the plan. It was, to use the phrase that politicians always use, a distraction. And it was 529 tax plans. Who here knows what a 529 college savings plan is? Hands up, who knows what a 529 is? Yeah, OK, so that makes it an unusual crowd. But many of the audiences I speak to, 529 college savings plans allow you to save for educational expenses in a fund that is capital gains tax free when you take it out. In many states, it's also set against income tax. So where I live in Maryland, my wife and I can put $10,000 aside for our 2 kids and set that against Maryland income tax. That saves us about $500 a year. You can also super fund the fund. You can put in up to, I think, $250,000 without paying gift tax, which you would otherwise pay, etc. It is a tax giveaway to the upper middle class. If you don't believe me, look at these numbers. These are by income quartile, poorest on the left to the richest on the right. And on the left-hand axis is how many households in that quartile have a 529, and on the right is how much is in that 529. Makes sense. You're not going to pay capital gains tax unless you have a reasonably high income anyway. And the thing is that you can only save money for your kids' future college if you have money to save, which is why it was a Bush-era tax cut. It was vetoed by Clinton. Bush passed it. And Obama's idea was to, not retrospectively, to keep what was there, but looking forward to get rid of it, and instead to have a tax credit, which would be more progressive. Everybody lost it. The argument went huge over this 529 college savings plan. This is the median income in Pelosi and Van Hollen's districts. Median, I should know, I live in Van Hollen's district, as I said. This is the median. These are liberal Democrats, pretty liberal Democrats from affluent areas. These are the places where 529 plans live. And the liberal upper middle class lost it over the idea that they were going to lose this unbelievably regressive tax break. It is the most regressive element in the tax system. I cannot find anything else that is so tilted towards the top. Even the mortgage interest deduction and some of the others, even the tax breaks for pensions cannot compare to the regressivity of the 529 college savings plan. But God help any politician who tries to take it away from us. Why? Because we have become a bit entitled. And this is Paul Waldman's line. The upper middle class are the single most dangerous constituency to anger. Wealthy enough to have influence and numerous enough to be a significant voting bloc. So there's a difference here between different kinds of inequality. There's the plutocrat inequality that Nancy's written about and talked about, and there's a different kind of inequality that you might think of as a bourgeois kind of inequality, which is the separation of the top 20%, 15%, which is what my book is about. You don't want to mess with these people. And in a flash, I realized that the American upper middle class knows how to take care of itself. It has political muscle, and it has become, there is a problem of entitlement in the US, but it's at the top. It is this group of people who feel entitled to their tax breaks, entitled to their higher incomes, because they feel that they deserve them. And that's the problem with having class divisions in a society that prides itself on being classless. So now I'm going to quickly go through some of these slides, because they're in the book. And so these are tax expenditures. These are upside-down tax breaks for the bottom 40, middle 40, and top 20%. It's in the book, basically just making the point that the tax expenditures in the US are highly regressive. They're upside down. 529s don't even appear on there because there's not very much, but mortgage interest deduction, state and local tax deductions, $70 billion a year. Distortionary, but God help anybody who tries to touch our mortgage interest deduction. Same as 529s. We feel entitled to them, and it's distorted the housing market very badly in the US for a long time. There's a reason why other countries, including my old country, got rid of the mortgage interest deduction. It's a stupid policy. But God help you trying to change it here, because it's helping me to buy a much more expensive house than I would otherwise be able to. So that's the reason I wrote this book, which we've already mentioned, and here's my argument in brief. That the upper middle class is separating economically, socially, residentially, occupationally from everybody else. And that inequality is not just now, it's across generations. There's intergenerational inequality or stratification. Briefly going to discuss them between relative and absolute mobility. I'm going to argue for downward mobility. This is the least popular part of my argument. This has ruined many dinner parties. But it is a fact that there are some parts of mobility are zero-sum. That means for some people to rise, other people have to fall. And that's the bit that no one likes. And then I'm going to argue why this is happening, partly because of market meritocracy, secondly because of opportunity hoarding, and then how we have to solve the I'm not rich problem. So I'm going to do that probably, in about 10 minutes, do you think? Would that be all right, Nancy? How long do you want me to talk for?
Right. Yes.
So I'll have to skip through a few of them, I think. So first of all, the first thing I argue is that it's not just the top 1%. It's a broader inequality problem than that. But in fairness, let's put up a top 1% chart. This is a We Are the 99% chart. I think We Are the 99% is one of the least helpful political slogans of recent time. And I'm going to say why in a moment. But to be fair, this is the real incomes of the top 1%, and then the 19% below them, then the 40% below them, and then the 40% below them. Okay? Wow, look at those people at the top. So to be in the top 1% now, you need a household income of $400,000 or more, roughly, a bit more than that now. And to be in the top 20%, you need a household income now of about $125,000. And it looks to me as if they're galloping away, okay? Look at us all trapped at the bottom. We're all in the same boat. I am just an ordinary member of the middle class after all. But look at the left-hand scale. Social scientists do their dirty work in two places, their footnotes and their left-hand axes. It goes up to 2 million. So tell you what, let's take the top 1% out altogether, right? So a lot of people that Nancy will write about will obviously be up there. So in the next one, I take out the top 1% altogether. So they don't appear in this chart. First of all, look at the left-hand axis. Suddenly I don't need to go up to 2 million anymore. And I think this is a more interesting, in some ways, for me, more interesting kind of inequality. Because you're seeing a separation here, which is about a much bigger group than just the top 1%. There's been no increase in income inequality in the bottom 80% of the US distribution. It's not true that the gap between rich and poor has grown bigger. The gap between the rich, defined as the top 20%, and everybody else has grown bigger. And so, whilst it's a less dramatic chart, because of what I've had to do with the left-hand axis, I've taken the top 1% out altogether, and this is the inequality problem that I think we don't pay enough attention to. It is not to say the top 1% are not a problem. There's a big problem with the top 1%. But it's to say that is not the only problem. And it is way too easy for people who are not in the top 1% to blame the people above them. A third of the people in the Occupy May Day protest had earnings in the six figures. A third of them were earning at least $100,000 a year. It seems to me there's something wrong with an inequality debate that allows us to blame either people who are much richer than us or much poorer than us, but never ourselves. And so that's the debate that this is the inequality I try and talk about. I'm not going to get into this here particularly, but that's income. But I also think you see these big divisions now, top 20 in family structure. So there's been no retreat from marriage in the top 20%. Divorce rates are dropping among college graduates. But there's significant change in family structure lower down. Unintended pregnancy rates are very different. Also health, which I know is a big issue for you, Sandy, and your colleagues. Big gaps in health. Wealth, which I'll say a bit about. Life expectancy. Life expectancy is actually dropping for the poorest women in the US. But it's rising very quickly at the top, and so literally living longer has become a big class gap. Culture and social capital, by that I'm just referring to kind of Putnam-style networks within neighborhoods. Upper middle class neighborhoods are saturated with social capital, but they are pretty insular. Neighborhood segregation, we see more by economic segregation, and so on. And in fact, the neighborhood one is just worth pausing on because it relates a little bit to the issue about race. Racial segregation of US neighborhoods, as many of you in the room will know, has dropped a little bit. It's come down somewhat over the last few decades in the US. But I always have to be the one pointing out that kind of had to, given where it started. Okay, so Americans are very comfortable saying, oh, look, racial segregation is less in our cities. That's true, but look at where you started, and don't think for a moment that you're anywhere near anywhere other country in the world. To anybody who's not American, you look at levels of racial segregation of American cities in particular and go, are you kidding me? They're still incredibly segregated, the most segregated country in the world with a possible and weird exception of South Africa. So yes, it's dropping, but it's still very, very, very high indeed. But the other thing is that economic segregation is rising. And so the segregation of our neighborhoods by class and by income is getting greater. So to put it very, very crudely and bluntly, it is slightly more likely that an upper middle class white American will have a neighbor of a different race, slightly more likely. But it is less likely that that neighbor will be of a different class. So you're slightly more likely to have, but they'll be a lawyer. You're not going to have someone who is working class or even middle class in your neighborhood. So it endures across generations. Now I'm going to speed up. We create charts like this a lot. This is an intergenerational quintile income transition matrix. We make them all the time at Brookings. Our days fly by. We have fun with these. I'm just going to make the point, it's where you're born by income quintile and where you end up. Everyone tends to focus on the this here, being stuck in poverty. I focus instead on here, being stuck in affluence. We never talk about that. We never talk about the fact that there's a perpetuation of affluence and that 40% of the kids stay up there. No, there's mobility, don't get me wrong. So let's just investigate that and see what's happening there. This is wealth. This is what quintile your parents were by wealth and what quintile you are. Wealth is even stickier, as you might expect across generations. So 44% chance of staying in the top 20%. You can do it for education, you can do it for any number of different things. But I'm just going to make the point that the US actually has a stickier top in terms of its income distribution than other countries over generations. More perpetuation of upper middle class status. I'm going to talk very briefly about the difference between relative and absolute mobility because it's important to my argument. Relative mobility is the one I've just shown you, move up and down the ladder. Absolute mobility is, are you better off than your parents were? This is Raj Chetty's data. You probably know his work. If you don't, you should. He's the leader of this field now because he has everyone's tax records. He has your tax record. I mean, it's anonymized, don't worry. But, and this is the percentage of people by the year they were born who are better off than their parents were at the same age. Post-war, everyone was. Now, half of us are. And there's a problem because the post-war boom was so great that a lot of people can say, oh, my parents were pretty poor and look at me. Well, that's what happens when your economy grows at 4% a year for 25 years. Pretty much everyone gets better off. Doesn't mean everyone's moved places, just means they're better off. However, and that's particularly true in the Rust Belt, see the last election. Why? Mostly because I'll skip through this, but basically the Chetty stuff shows that it's really about the distribution. So low growth is part of it, distribution is the other part of it. Crudely put, the drop in absolute mobility is 2/3 about inequality and 1/3 about low growth. So more growth would be good, but more equality would be better. Steve Pearlstein, who writes the Post, gave me this analogy. He said, when everyone's getting better off, you have high growth, if someone overtakes you on the highway, you don't mind, right? Let's say you're going 50, 60 miles per hour, someone goes past you, you don't mind, do you? Well, if you do, you've got deeper problems than I can deal with here. It's fine, but imagine so that's high growth, but when you're in gridlock, someone cuts in, oh, that makes you mad. And this is quite a good analogy, I think, between this is a world of high growth, where relative mobility is easier, it's less painful. This is a world of low growth, where suddenly the stakes are much higher. Suddenly, it really seems to count. And I think this is closer to the world we're in now. And so it explains part of the desperation of the upper middle class. I'm going to make the case for downward mobility. And here, I'm just going to quote sociologist Mike Miller, who actually talks about the fact that downward mobility is a better indicator of fairness than upward mobility. I won't say any more about that. However, the idea of downward mobility is not very popular. So some psychologists actually asked people what they thought would be the ideal amount of upward mobility. And this is what people said. They broke them into liberals and conservatives. This is asking people, what do you think should happen to people in that bottom quintile? Where should they end up? And basically, they're wildly utopian about mobility. Both liberals and conservatives agree that if you're born in the bottom 20%, you should have just as good a chance of getting to the top almost as at the bottom. In fact, conservatives a bit more so. Massively in favor of upward relative mobility from that bottom quintile. Right? And then the Pew data on the right shows you the actual numbers, how people are stuck. Okay. Let's ask people about downward mobility, because this is relative, right? You can only get 20% of the population in every quintile. So let's ask people what they think should happen to the top quintile. People think that people who are born in the top quintile should stay there, roughly in line with the current numbers. So let me see. You want everyone at the bottom to be upwardly mobile, but you don't want anyone at the top to be downwardly mobile. Okay, I get it. But mathematically, that's not possible. It doesn't actually add up, right? Why? Because of this idea of upward mobility. And I think it's partly because people are confusing absolute and relative mobility. But let's just be clear. If you want more upward relative mobility, you need more downward relative mobility. That's not a moral statement. That's a math statement. So decide, which is it? If you don't want more relative downward mobility, then you cannot have more upward relative mobility. So let's at least be honest about that. And that's part of the argument of the book. I wrote this piece in the Times called Stop Pretending You're Not Rich. Generated some comments, to say the least. This is one from a guy in Oak Park, Illinois. And I really like this comment, because it talks about this sense of it's a long way down. You think about Barbara Ehrenreich's book, Fear of Falling. It's a long way down. And it is a long way down. It's further to fall in the US and becoming further. This is the gap between the 90th and the 50th percentile. It's a bigger drop. You look down there, and you don't like the look of it down there. And that's especially true in a country like the US, where things like health insurance really count in terms of your income, where money buys a lot more. Money's more important in the US and more unequal. And so actually the fear of falling is both economic, but it's also everything else that will come with it. Okay, why is this happening? Very briefly, for two reasons. One, The market, to the extent that it's meritocratic, rewards the accumulation of human capital and skills that allow you to succeed in the market. The problem is there is such massive inequality in the accumulation of those skills in the first 20 or 25 years of life. The market arguably is becoming in some ways more meritocratic, and that's good in terms of breaking down race and gender barriers. I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's there yet, but as a force for kind of more egalitarianism, it's hard to be against the idea that it should be the best person for the job, mostly. And that's been a kind of powerful principle. The problem is that we enter the market with such different levels of preparation. So, as I say in the book, meritocracy is for adults, not children. So the idea of meritocratic education flies in the face of the idea of fairness. If you're going to have a meritocratic market, that's fine, but you need to be working very, very, very hard to get people as close as possible in terms of the preparation for it. So when I make that argument, we should basically have a free market, but then massive redistribution in the early years. The left hate the first bit, the right hate the second bit. So everyone hates the argument for one reason or another. So if you haven't read this book, you must read this book. He coined the term meritocracy. It's a British sociologist, and it's a warning. It's a dystopia. Michael Young warns against a world in which this idea of meritocracy takes up. And he says that what will happen in that world is a few things. One, there'll be a rise in inequality because the people who are at the top feel justified in keeping the rewards because they are meritorious. They got there through their diligence and brilliance. So point one is more inequality. Second, there'll be a corrosion of mutual respect across class lines because the winners will look down their noses at the losers. After all, if you're in a meritocracy and you don't succeed, it can only be your fault. The losers in a meritocracy will lose self-respect because they're constantly being told there's nothing in their way and they can succeed. If they don't therefore succeed, it can only be their fault. And so there's a corrosion of respect in both directions in the meritocracy. And then finally, what will happen is that people will increasingly marry, and produce children on class lines. There's this stunningly unromantic term, which some of you may know, assortative mating, which means marrying people like yourself. I don't suggest using it when you're dating. But what it means is that people are more likely to marry people with similar levels of education to themselves. And so what's happening is college graduates marrying college graduates, that doubles their earning potential. That's driving a lot of household income inequality. And Young predicted exactly that. That in a society where you're rewarding those sorts of merit, then people will marry for merit and mate for merit. This is educational status across generations. Education is the big story here in the first transmission. This is by quintile of fathers here, because we had to do fathers for this. Education is even stickier than income and wealth. So 46% of those who have a father in the top education quintile will be in the top education quintile themselves. So education is even more strongly inherited than income and wealth. If you are upper middle class, you get a four-year college degree. If you're not, you don't. This is over time for the groups, and I apologize I'm going quickly through this. The US higher education system is where the class fracture is shown. This is bottom 40, middle 40, 20 by what kind of colleges they go to. This is people who are going to college. I'm now excluding them who are going to. So if you just look at that period, right? It's higher education institutions that really show the US class system at work, and that's because we know that higher education is crucial for their labour market success. So we're obsessed about it. And to some extent, correctly so, because of its predictive power in the labour market. It's harder to, obviously we have deep divisions all the way through, but if you want the moment, the aha moment when the US class system reveals itself, it is in post-secondary education. It ruthlessly sorts people by income background into institutional type. We then lavishly fund the colleges at the top and underfund the community colleges and other institutions that fund the poorest kids. It is quotes, meritocratic and therefore deeply unfair. This is looked at from the other point of view, which is what percentage of your students are from the upper middle class. This is not percentage from that class going, but if you're just looking at this, so the Ivies and the elites, 2/3 of their kids are from the top 20%. Then selectives and non-selectives, middle 40 and so on. So essentially there are institutions like this one where you struggle to find someone who isn't upper middle class. Most of those kids come from upper middle class schools and neighborhoods. They may go into upper middle class occupations. And so effectively, they might really very rarely come into contact with people from outside. It's not fair just to, let's pick on a few here, Harvard, UC Berkeley, and Glendale Community College nearby. This is Chetty's data again. But let's talk about Duke. Of the undergraduates at Duke, 19% of the undergraduates here are from the top 1%, 56% are from the top 10%, 69% from the top 20%, 4% from the bottom 20%. There is a 17-fold difference between the number of students from the top quintile and bottom quintile at Duke. This is an upper middle class institution by any stretch of the imagination. And by the way, there has been no increase in the number of kids in the bottom 20% going to Duke in the last 10, 15 years, or any other institution in the US except for profits. It replicates through higher education. I will skip Bernard Williams' Warrior Society, much though I like it. It's in the book. Next, opportunity hoarding. It's not just the human capital formation, it's the way we cheat. And I'm just going to briefly mention the three. I've taken this from Tilley, his book, Enduring Inequality, as many of you know. He talks about opportunity hoarding. He's actually talking as much about race and ethnic groups in his book. I'm talking about class. But I think opportunity hoarding is where we consume a good that is valuable for opportunity in a way that's independent of any kind of independent of any meritocratic virtue. In other words, we cheat. We're cheating. It's allocated anti-competitively. And I have 3 examples in the book. There are many others. Zoning, legacies, internships. Zoning is clearly the biggest deal. Exclusionary zoning, building on racist redlining in many cases, allows people to protect the value of their property. This is rent versus household income based on a 100 index. Yes, housing is getting expensive in the US. The US is getting smaller in the sense that the economic growth areas are small, expensive. Why is housing getting so expensive? Well, maybe it's because of this. This is Gannon Schragg's measure of number of court cases that mention housing regulations. This is a highly regulated housing market in many cities now. The way that zoning is used to keep out low income or even modest income housing is a big problem. Labor mobility has dropped. The number of people crossing state lines has halved on some measures in the last 15 years, especially low-skilled workers. Part of the reason why is because it's very expensive. This is my favorite example, which is from a PhD student, the Council of Economic Advisors. This is LA's zoning. In 1960, LA was zoned for 10 million people. Now it's zoned for 4.3 million people, which is exactly the number of people that live there. LA's zoning regulations shrunk to fit its actual population. We were right in 1960. There's room for 10 million people in LA, but we can't put 10 million in there anymore. Why not? Because of local zoning regulations. And many of those are exclusionary, and they help people to protect the value of their assets, of the houses. So let's imagine, so putting it all together, you have a situation where you buy an expensive house. The Treasury helps you do that by subsidizing you to do that. It doesn't increase home ownership. It just increases the depth, not the breadth of home ownership, the depth. Helps people buy more expensive houses. Okay, so I've got my expensive house subsidized by the taxpayer. Thank you. Let's organize education geographically so that my kids go to public high school, but it's a great school. Actually, there's inclusionary zoning where I live. But let's say it's a good school, and you can attract better teachers to those schools because there's less trouble there. That's great. So I've got my house, I've got education organized geographically. What could ruin that? I tell you what could ruin that is if lots of poorer people moved into my neighborhood. I think that's going to affect the value of my house. I'm probably wrong about that. I think it's going to affect the quality of my kids' education. I'm probably wrong about that. But I don't know, and I don't want to take the risk. So what can I do? Thank God, zoning. I can zone them out. I can have single-family dwelling regulations, etc. I can keep them out. So I am not saying that some evil genius intent on class stratification sat down and said, let's subsidize expensive houses, then have zoning, and then organize education geographically. I'm not saying that they did that. I'm suggesting that if they did, they might come up with a system a bit like this. It's not anyone's intent, but it's the result. And the incentives to change it are weak for those of us on the right side of it. Legacy admissions. I have one slide on each of these. I'm going to stop. Legacies, really? Legacy preferences? Seriously? I mean, I have a long spiel about this, but I think I'll just say, seriously? These are legacy admissions rates at various colleges. I haven't got Duke on here, sadly, but the Harvard admissions said, it's a slight tip. Well, maybe. We don't know. Why don't we know? Because they don't share the data. Why won't they share the data? Because they don't want us to know. Either they don't want us to know because it's making a big difference, and that would be embarrassing, or it's not making a big difference, and they don't want their donors to know that. Either way, it's, seriously? A hereditary principle in operation, in access to higher education? Wow, that's American exceptionalism. No other country in the world does it. Wow. We got rid of it in the middle of the 20th century in the UK. Our royal family can't get into Oxford and Cambridge. They can't get in. They don't get the grades. Right. It's absurd, outrageous. Maybe it's trivial, but I think it's symbolically important because it suggests that pretty much anything goes. We will play any card to get our kids into the best possible college. And you've given up something very precious if you allow this system to remain. So yes, it's largely symbolic, but boy, what a symbol. Internships becoming more important. Many of them are allocated informally, grace and favor basis. Employers really like them. Employers in one survey ranked doing an internship as very important. And so if we are giving them out in any way that isn't fair and meritocratic and transparent, then we have just given up something else very important too. And again, the US is a bit exceptional in this case. Bill de Blasio, when his first acts as mayor in New York, 2 internships in City Hall against City Hall policies for his 2 kids. Michael Bloomberg did it before him. What shocked me about the de Blasio story was that no one knew or cared. Yeah, of course. He's helping his kids get a valuable internship in City Hall. But hold on, that's 2 people who didn't get an internship in City Hall. This is a zero-sum game. And so if you're allocating your internships unfairly, you're doing something to... Again, I'm not going to overstress the numbers involved there, but it is a huge problem. Right, I'm done. The only problem we've got is people don't think they're rich. So yes, the rich should pay more tax, but no, I don't mean me. I mean the Koch brothers. Or the people, I know people who have to use net jets. They share a private jet, and they want to tax the rich, by which they mean the people who've got their own jet. So if you ask people to define the annual income needed to be rich, on the right-hand side, it's people who have a household income more than $100,000. They think you need $500,000 a year to be rich. People who have under $30,000 think you need $100,000 to be rich. So in other words, being rich is relative. And then lastly, the nicest review of my book said, this is a moral argument thinly disguised as a policy pamphlet. Nicest thing anyone said about the book. That's exactly what it is. Because my own view is we have policies. We don't have a political culture that allows us to follow them and get rid of some of these egregious things. We know what we should be doing. Why don't we have the politics that allows us to? Because we don't have a culture that allows for it. And one of the reasons we don't have a culture that allows for it is because those of us who are winning in the inequality debate have yet to see that and to take personal responsibility for it and give some stuff up. I am over the enlightened self-interest argument. It hasn't worked. It's time to use words like sacrifice, solidarity. And I was told I had to read Hofstadter, so I did. And he said this about the progressive era. Now, there are lots of reasons why the progressive era was very unprogressive, which I don't need to go into the details of this audience. But to the extent that it did bring about some changes which were valuable, it was preceded by what Hofstadter called an affair of the conscience. It was by no means directed entirely against others, the moral indignation. It was in great and critical measure directed inward. Contemporaries who spoke at the moment as an affair of the conscience were not mistaken. Right now, the inequality debate, the stratification debate, is always about other people. It's never directed inward. And I actually have come to believe, like Jerry Cohen in his wonderful book, If You're an Egalitarian, How Come You're So Rich? Great book, great title. That fairness and social justice is not just found in structures and in numbers, but it is to be found, and this is a quote from him, in the thick of everyday life. And I've come to believe quite strongly that we have to think about the way we conduct ourselves in the thick of everyday life, as well as how we vote and support, because inequality is not just an abstract thing, it's also a personal thing. It's how we conduct ourselves in our institutions, in our neighborhoods, in our daily interactions, in the thick of everyday life. And until and unless we motivate people and recognize this and have an affair of the conscience, then it seems to me all the policies in the world will still be on the shelf, waiting for a moment when actually someone can enact them. With that, I'll stop. Thanks, Nancy.
All right. So I wanted to kick it off just by saying I love Richard's book. I thought it was incredibly important. The only thing that I would have added to a lot of the sentences is except if you're black or Hispanic. So I kind of want to talk about the necessity of when we talk about class in America having the overlay of race. Because while class might be the dominant feature, the dominant problem in countries around the world, I think race is our big, ugly, unsolvable issue that taints just about everything. So the chapter I wanted to focus on, and the chapter that I thought was particularly important, is chapter 5, I believe, about meritocracy. Yeah. And one of the things Richard just said was that meritocracy in the US rewards accumulation of human capital. And to that I would add, unless you're a person of color. And I agree with the original premise, which is that when it comes to accumulating that human capital in the first place, when it comes to what schools you go to, what camps you go to, whether or not your parents are reading to you at night, et cetera, there is a vast gap, and that is something that needs to be solved in the first place. What I would say, though, is that what we know is that even when brown people are able to accumulate that human capital, their returns in the labor market are not the same. Every year, it seems there's a new study that shows what the impact of having a black-sounding name is, right? There was one study that said if you sent out a resume and your name seemed white or racially ambiguous, it would take 10 resumes to get a response. If you had a black or Hispanic-sounding name, 15. There was another study in 2016 where people whitened their names. Their callbacks were twice as high. I wrote about a study 2 years ago when we were still trying to solve the long-term unemployment issue. Black people who were unemployed for more than 26 weeks and had comparable skills to white people who were unemployed for 26 weeks with comparable skills were less likely to get called back for jobs. When they did, their employers were more likely to put them under heavy surveillance. So constantly checking in on them, more frequent reviews, and that obviously increases the chance that they're going to catch an error. When they caught an error for a black person, when they caught an error for a white person, guess who's getting fired more quickly, right? And again and again and again, the thing that we see is that educational gaps do not account for all of this. Some of it is racism. Some of it is the fact that while posh people in the UK, have the dignity to feel bad, not that many white people broadly feel guilty about our system, right? They're not fixing it. They don't feel bad enough to the end point to sacrifice something. They don't feel bad enough to pay more taxes. They don't feel bad enough to talk about the R word. So where does that leave us? And I think one of the things that I thought was really important to kind of do in concert with the book is to talk about the way that race plays into this.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, why don't you respond, and then we'll open it up to the audience for.
It's a very big question, and one of my regrets about the book is that I didn't incorporate some of the points you just made, and some work that I've done myself on race and mobility. I think you may have even written up the work we did, which when you look at the relative mobility rates for black and white Americans, they're astonishingly different. So if you're born into the bottom 20% and you're black, you have a 50% chance of staying there as an adult. If you're white, it's half that, 25%. So you're twice as likely to be stuck in poverty if you're born black and poor. More striking in some ways, even more striking, is that if you're born into a family in the middle income quintile and you're black, you have a 70% chance of falling down the income ladder, 35% if you're white. And so it's not just that being poor and black doubles your chances of remaining poor compared to whites. It is that if you're born middle class and black, you're twice as likely to be downwardly mobile, relatively speaking, as well. So I just add those data points to reinforce your point that race really, really matters above and beyond class in the US. I strongly agree with that. As it happens, the upper middle class are predominantly white, remain predominantly white. There's been almost no increase in the black proportion of the top 20%. For some of the reasons that we've just identified. And I think you're right that when it comes to this sense of, let's use guilt, okay, as that there is a lack of guilt on the part of whites. But I think it's tied up with this fiction of meritocracy. Absolutely. And I actually think that's now being repurposed for racist ends. Because you'll see people saying, well, look at Asian Americans, for example, who are doing very well. Or black Americans who move here more recently, they're doing pretty well. People say, well, look, we're a meritocracy, so if black Americans who've been here, multi-generational, there's something wrong with them, right? I think I'm crudely putting it. No one would ever be that crude about it, but that's what they're saying, kind of between the lines. Society's not racist, it's meritocratic, ergo the problems of black people can only be problems of black people themselves. So I do think they come together in that psychologically, and I haven't really thought through all of that enough. I guess I would say in response to your point about the labour market, the labour market and employers remain racist, many, and sexist. So you can do similar studies around gender. But I would argue, and I'd be very interested in people's responses to this, but that over time, becoming less so. I don't know if you would agree with that, but I think that over time, the barriers that are caused by discriminatory attitudes are being lowered. Are they being lowered quickly enough? No. Are they down? No. But I think that you said some of it's explained by racism. That's true. But if you do get a good quality education and you're African American, then I think your chances of doing well now are higher than they were 40, 50 years ago. Okay, so trending in the right direction, albeit way too slowly. Now the question is, what do we want to do about that? I think we want to increase. We don't, in my view, we want to keep the valuable bit of market meritocracy without the dangerous bit of it, which is thinking that that means outcomes are only the result of people's own efforts, because it's what happens before that. Would you agree that it's getting better?
So this is what I would say to that. I would say if you look at the entirety of the trend line over generations, is my generation better than my grandfather, who was born in 1890 to a sharecropping family? Yes. I will take that. But what I will also say is that, one, obviously that trend line in between is not static, right? Like it does not consistently go up, which is problematic. But also, so one of the things that I look at a lot is corporations and businesses and how well they're doing at integrating their ranks, particularly higher up. Yeah. And I think sometimes a lot of the change that we see and a lot of the change that we celebrate happens at lower levels, right? So we'll see a lot of diversification at entry-level jobs at big companies, and we'll celebrate it. That's great, love it. There's so many brown people at Google. And then you look at their management, and there are none. I just wrote a piece that I think went up today about how there are now 4 black CEOs of a Fortune 500 company. By February of next year, that will be 3. So that trend line, and for Latino CEOs as well, went like this, stalled out, and is now coming right back down. And that's not because fewer brown people are getting MBAs. It's not because fewer brown people are going to law school. It's not for any of those things. A large part of the reason that people think that is because when you have a white CEO and a predominantly white board, and they look around and they say, who am I going to take under my wing? Who am I going to think of and mentor and bring out to dinner? They're choosing the white guy who looks exactly like them, who they understand on a visceral level. And maybe that's racist, maybe that's not, but it is the way things work. And there are all those kind of soft interactions that still happen day after day after day. They're built into the system, they're codified. So if those things don't change, I think what we're celebrating is kind of this incremental change. And also when you look at the fact that brown people have been here for just as long as white people for the most part, the fact that we're still having conversations where it's the first black X, the first black person to win Y, the first Latina to be recognized as this. That's insane. It's insane given the number of years that we've all been here supposedly together, right? So I think when we talk about progress, what we're trying to say is how much of this has worked its way out of the system, and quite frankly, not enough. Not nearly enough. And I think there is the tendency to want to kind of pat ourselves on the back. And for instance, when we talk about neighborhoods, when we talk about the fact that if you live in an upper class neighborhood, right, now there's a higher chance that your neighbor is going to be a black lawyer who makes as much as you do versus a poor white person. I mean, sure, but only 20 years ago, 30 years ago, did some of those enclaves start to get changed around. And I would say my parents' generation, if you were an affluent brown person in Chicago, you were living in Chatham. If you were an affluent black person in Detroit, you were living in your own suburb, right? There just wasn't the integration. So I think it's hard to then celebrate, 20 years worth of progress when you look at how long it took to get that.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've just said. I think that, I hope we'll get into this, the politics of the way race and class are playing out now is really disturbing. Yeah. You'll see that racial sentiments explain a lot of support for Trump. Actually, that's where you'll find the majority saying that actually whites are now being discriminated against. A high proportion of people actually agree with that statement now, particularly the kind of Trump supporters. And what they see as this is middle income or lower income whites who believe this completely crazy thing, they're angry at everybody, but they're angry apart at the liberal upper middle class as well. You know, I think that one of the things that Trump did was to kind of position himself in a kind of quite a blue-collar way as against all these professionals. And they have been convinced that one of the things these liberal upper-middle-class people are doing is discriminating against whites.
Right.
And so I completely agree with you that we're at a dangerous moment in terms of the debate here. And my regret is that one way to interpret my book is that it's all about class.
Right.
Okay, we need to worry about the white working class rather than where the real problem is, which is around structural racism. So I say it's a regret, and it kind of genuinely is. And I do think that we need to think about them together. I don't think I'm very good at that yet. And so I think it's something that I'm being more cautious about, perhaps, in terms of the way I think about it. But I agree with you that there is a very, very long way to go.
Yeah, to the point about some of the pain that comes up in the election of Trump, I think the conversation we were having last night, kind of these two crystallized points, really represent the impasse well, where you said, it's really hard, essentially, to lose status, even though we might think that that is a ridiculous and wah, don't care, right?
Yeah.
When you lose something, it's still painful, and you still want to blame somebody, and that is what a lot of white Americans, particularly white American men, are feeling, right? And the sentiment that I've had and that I've really resonated with for the past few months has been, Lord, give me the confidence of a mediocre white man, right? And I feel like but I feel like it's so representative of like the two places that America is right now. And when those are the standpoints you're coming from, it is really hard to meet in the middle. It is really hard to find a common ground, and to go back to a point that you made, to respect each other, to respect where the other person is coming from, so we can even remotely move on to have a different conversation.
And speaking of conversations, why don't we bring in people from the audience who want to share? I guess we should be using the microphones.
Yes, I want people to come to the microphone because we're recording.
And maybe introduce yourself before you ask your question or make your comment. Whoops. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. This is wonderful. My name is Yasmin Arizari. I'm an assistant professor in African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Austin, supposedly progressive city, now the most, income stratified or income, has the highest level of income inequality in the country. A lot of people don't know that about Austin. So just want to mention that, because we're dealing with a lot of these things now as they're voting for $1 billion bond that would support a magnet program that is about 75% white and Asian in a school district that's 70% Latino and Black. So these things are happening, and I'm so ready to go to these parents and hand them your book. One thing I want to mention about this issue about the intersection of race and class is that a lot of the things you mentioned about these differences are differences where these groups are actually living very separately from these other groups, right? They're very separated. But a lot of the inequality that I'm seeing when I'm studying race is the inequality is happening when they're together. So it's not just the inequalities happening when they're separate, but also together, because it's perpetuated in both spaces. And so one of the things that I think about when I think about the perpetuation of this inequality is not just this kind of exclusionary zoning and the use of education, but also within schools, the use of separation. So I study racialized tracking. I'm doing one of the first studies on this in the country. 3 out of every 4 Black students in this country attends a high school that is racially tracked. And the majority of the other 25% go to an all-Black school. So Black students, regardless of their income level, will enter a school if it's diverse, where they're being tracked into general classes or lower level classes and out of the courses, the opportunities that will get them into those kinds of colleges. So it's being created early, and we're just seeing it manifest in the way they get to universities. What was really interesting is that Amanda Lewis and John Diamond have a book that came out in 2015, Despite the Best Intentions. And in it, there's a really interesting quote. I think it was from a student. It says, like, when they get to high school, because they talked about when the children were younger, and this is a suburban school, really diverse area. Most of the parents are middle class, so this is not an area where there's kind of a race-class divide jointly, but instead mostly just maybe a race divide, but not so much class. And when they get to the high school, one of the Black students said, we're all the dumb white kids. Because when they were in elementary school, there were some really smart white kids, and there were some not so smart white kids. But then when they got to high school, all the white kids were in AP calculus and in all these advanced classes, and none of them were in the general classes. And when they started doing interviews with parents that that were currently living there and formerly living there, they discovered that white progressive parents were only invested in the project of integration if their own children benefited from it. So they were only invested in that kind of situation as long as their own children got those kinds of spots at the top above black and brown students. And as soon as they didn't, they moved to all white suburbs. So I just want to mention that as one way to really think about this intersection, because it's not just about separation, because even in places where they meet, there are all these processes within walls that we can't even see that are also perpetuating these things.
Powerful point.
Right.
Do you guys want to respond to that?
Well,
It was really like a commentary, because I'd really like to know what he thinks about that and how that connects with what he's talking about, because most of what you've talked about is about divisions that are...
sure. Well, I will say a bit about it. I think the Where Are the Dumb White Kids one is a really good one. We have a phrase in the UK which is Tim nice but dim. It's based on a comedy character, and Tim is very posh, quite nice, but very dim. And he does very well because he's posh. And there's this issue, and so I wrote a paper about the glass floor, which is effectively how do you take kids who are dumb, to use your phrase, your term, dumb kids, and basically disguise or reduce their dumbness, so that by the time they hit the labour market, either their dumbness has been really pretty well camouflaged by all this education and social skills and all the rest of it. So by the time the employer finds out, it's too late. Or and I think that happens a lot, or that you just double down on the investment in them. So Bob Putnam's work shows that if you take kids in the bottom third of the testing distribution in middle school who are from affluent households, they're more likely to get a four-year college degree than kids from the top third of the testing distribution in middle school who come from poor households. So something happens, and what happens is we all know it, we're parents, right? I've got 3 kids, okay? Are we being recorded? One of them's dumb. Let's assume one of them's dumber than the other 2. Right, what am I doing with him? I'm not saying, oh well, never mind. He's not going to do it. No, we're just. I know he's getting more coaching and tutoring and attention or whatever, because I'm like, oh my god, he's a bit dumb. He's in real trouble. I mean, you're not allowed to say this because all our children of course, our children are all brilliant. There's no regression to the mean among our kids, is there? Right? But so by the time he comes out into the labour market, I can assure you that my dumb kid will A, be less dumb because and B, won't seem dumb because he'll have learned all the kind of class, and some of these are racialized as well, that kind of thing, ways to conduct himself in the world that signal that he's not dumb. And so even the dumb kids from the top do pretty well. And if it's zero sum, what it means is there are smart kids in the bottom of it. And it's because we have this meritocratic idea in the education system. And we talked about the market and how meritocratic the market is. My issue is tracking is a great example of, well, it's meritocratic. New York's public high schools, meritocratic entry. As a result, they're all white and Asian. They can say, well, it's not our fault, it's a test. They're the ones who do well on the test. It's like, that's not how you're supposed to do education. Education is supposed to be anti-meritocratic. By which I mean it should be systematically trying to level the playing field. Otherwise, all we do is keep giving more and more and more to the ones who've already got a lot. We should be doing exactly the opposite. Look at the numbers for Duke. All right, great education. They go there. So where do those kids come from? They all come from the top. Then we invest more in them. What we need is an admissions criteria that massively takes into account background, income and race. We need to totally change the way we think about meritocracy in education. Now, as a parent, that's hard. I don't want to understate that. Okay, this is tough. But as a matter of policy, we have to recognise the fact that what's good for there is a trade-off here.
We could just add to that, too. There was just a recent study, somebody may be familiar with it, about the fundraising that's gone on in top colleges and how they're raking in huge amounts of money. I mean, I believe Duke just raised $2 billion, right? But at the same time that these other schools are starving. And so it is a really interesting example of what you're talking about. So we'll go back and forth between the two sides. So your turn.
My name is Carter Q. I'm from the Stanford Warren Branch Library. Professor Reeves, you had just mentioned the possible lessening of job discrimination, et cetera, but there was a recent, Mike Walden, the economist at North Carolina State University, has recently, there was a report that came out, and he talked about the impact of technological obsolescence relative to affecting the middle class. And so within the next 20 years, so for instance, as a result of technological obsolescence, do you think that there would be an even greater entrenchment by the UMC relative to even people who are even further at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder?
What a great question. Do you want to have a go at that?
Nope,
first?
that's all yours.
So that's basically what Young wrote about that. And in fact, Vonnegut's first book, Play a Piano, is about a world where the elite make machines that generate all the economic growth. And they have to find something for everyone else to do. So Vonnegut was ahead of Young in that sense, in his dystopian. There's a big question about how far we'll see this obsolescence. On current trends, yes, it will make things worse because more of the obsolescence is going to be in the middle of the distribution than at the top. Over time, we'll see what happens. In a way, it could be another hoarding mechanism, which is the professionals protect themselves against technical change whilst allowing everybody else to be affected by it. So for example, lots of what lawyers do, pretty soon, machine learning can do a whole lot better. You're already seeing it in medicine, radiology. I don't want a human radiologist.
And I think Susskind, Daniel, I think Daniel and
Yeah,
Richard
Susskind,
Susskind talk about that in the
yeah.
future of the professions.
So we'll see. It might end up, but let's see, because the upper middle class now have to look after themselves. And so I think it's perfectly possible that they will find ways to protect their own jobs against automation, for a while anyway, whilst everyone else is being affected by it. So I would guess that in the short run, it's going to make things worse. In the long run, it's not clear to me that some of these jobs that the upper middle class do might not be automated as well. You've written a bit
Actually,
about that.
I will say that one section of the upper middle class has not done a very good job of protecting itself, and that's the professoriate. No occupation has been proletarianized as rapidly, at least I've read that from other people, as the professoriate in the United States. So the demise of tenure-line jobs, the rise of contingent work, terrible contracts. So I'm not confident that others will protect
I've
themselves
written
well.
a little bit about that and have been kind of trying to poke around that question. And the thing that I keep getting is that people are saying, in the long run, when we look at the trend line, it should not affect everyone equally, but it should kind of bring a level of pain to everyone, including upper middle class jobs. And the thing that I've said is basically this: the upper middle class will find a way. They'll find a way to squash it. They will find a way to turn their jobs around. But another thing that people have been saying is essentially going to happen is that it'll fundamentally change the nature of work to the point where people, don't have 40-hour-a-week full-time jobs. They'll be working part-time. And that will radically change kind of the social contract, how people get benefits and all these other things that Richard just talked about, and how that greatly benefits people in the upper middle class in the first place. So when we talk about reworking some of those benefits and some of those social constructs, who is reworking them and how are they going to rework them and who is that going to benefit? I mean, I think unless something radical changes, we know who that is. Also, who has the best cushion to be able to work some of these jobs that are, as kind of we have that pain point of change, right? As your job goes from 40 hours a week to 30 hours a week and you're trying to supplement or not, who's going to have the wherewithal to withstand that financially? Certainly isn't the folks who were working, 40 hours at a factory or a janitor or something like that.
Great. Over here.
Hi, yes. My name is Sarah Russell, and I am an academic dean here at Duke. And I'd like to go back to that question of what's happening in these elite universities, elite colleges. And I was wondering if we could think a little bit about another population that I think has an impact on some of the fear that drives the hoarding that you're talking about. And that is that, right now at Duke and at a lot of elite schools, something like 30% of the undergraduate population is Asian or Asian American. And one of the things that I've noticed, and I'll say, I've worked with Duke students for the past 5 years or so, and we have probably, I'm going to say this somewhat anecdotally, but I think probably would be able to see this in the numbers, is in those very narrowly defined meritocratic assessments, a lot of the Asian students are clocking in these astronomical numbers. They're the ones with the monster SATs, the monster ACTs, the monster, AP stuff. They are super driven on campus. They tend to be, I think right now the president of the DSG is an Asian American woman. And one of the things that I'm sort of wondering about is I see this causing, I feel like this drives a level of anxiety in the white student population significantly. And I see at the same time that it also squeezes out the resources and the openness and the flexibility towards the other constituent groups of students who don't come in having scored on these very narrowly defined numbers games. And I guess one of the things I'm curious about is how both of you think about this other population in the context of the mobility and the stickiness issues for African Americans and Anglo-Americans in this country.
Great question. Shall I go first?
Yeah, always.
So I mentioned the New York public high schools, and that's similar there. I can't remember the numbers now, but very high proportion Asian American students getting in. Fewer and fewer Black and Hispanic. Growing white anxiety. And so I guess my response would be of two kinds. One is, look, if you're going to run a narrow meritocracy, if you're going to have these very narrow definitions of it,
Right.
well, live with the results, okay? On the face of it, I shouldn't care. And it's ironic if whites, who've previously been dominating these institutions, then say, oh, hold on, there's a lot of Asians getting in now, let's change the rules. That's why we've got legacy preferences, by the way, to keep the Jewish students out.
Absolutely, yeah.
It worked pretty well for a while.
Yeah.
It's racist in origin. Many of the things that I talk about in class have racist origins, right? So the whites will cling to legacies because guess what? They're almost all white. Or any other way they can find to get in, early admissions, merit. I mean, the complexity of the US higher education system is such that if you know how to navigate it, So the whites will do that. So either live with it or, and the danger of this is this will feel like you're changing the rules, of course, is don't adopt such a narrowly meritocratic view because you're definitionally then going to disadvantage certain people on the basis of race and class and background and so on. Instead, let's move to an aggressively contextual admissions-based process where you take into account the background of the kids. Now, that's going to have all kinds of effects, I think, but you're right about the SAT distribution, by the way. The right-hand tail of the Asian SAT distribution is missing. So you do the distribution, SAT distribution for white, Hispanic, Black. There is no right-hand tail.
Exactly.
It's missing. It's cut off. I looked at the chart. So where's the right-hand tail? It's gone because they're up there, right? So I think it should be, and this is a controversial thing in some ways to say because it feels like you're changing the rules.
Exactly.
Because, the whites are panicking now. But I think we should just sit and think, meritocracy is the wrong way to think about this because all meritocracy so narrowly defined at that point in life replicates inequality, but just makes us feel better about it because we can say it was meritocratic. So let's just start again. Think about what college is for. Think about what we mean by merit. Think about what we're trying to do, and take into account background massively. I suspect actually that would be. I don't think Asian Americans will suffer very badly from that because. I think there's still enough Asian Americans who are low income.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I don't. But my back of the envelope calculations, you'd see a big increase in racial diversity if you were properly taking into account background, and not just saying, well, there's their SAT scores.
Right.
The SAT score is an expression of what's happened to them in the preceding 18 years.
Right.
It's not any measure of innate ability, and we can see that by the gaps growing. I just mentioned Putnam stuff. So this is just a way. I'll be really controversial about it. This is a way for elite higher education institutions to have a clear conscience while they perpetuate inequality.
Right.
That's what I think. And I'm not a professor, so I can say that.
I would just add to this, I think it might be helpful to us to remember that disenfranchisement in this country, which was racial disenfranchisement above all, was ostensibly race neutral because of the 15th Amendment, right? So we had things like the grandfather clause to keep people who were the descendants of freedmen from being able to vote. And I think it just I don't know, occurs to me thinking about this discussion here that we need to find ways to convey that to our students and our fellow citizens that in effect legacy admissions are like the grandfather clause that kept people from the polls. Just, I don't know, just a thought to share. I think we go...
I was just going to say, I would 110% double down on the context argument. I went to a very bougie school that loved to tout its diversity figures. And we used to laugh about it and call it so much diversity in one university. But it was like, this is the thing that happens when you have places like Harvard and other places being like, our incoming class is 50% minority. It's like, who are those kids? Who are they? I promise you, they are not the kids who went to public high schools and tried really hard and took the 2 AP classes that were offered. You know, even within the 4 years that I was at my Ivy League, I saw consistently the kids who came in who were minorities, class after class, more of them went to Exeter, more of them went to these super fancy schools, and the rest of us were like, oh, they're phasing us out. They're phasing us out. They don't want regular minority kids who tried really hard and did really well comparative to where they were. And it's a huge problem. It's because there is no context. It's because a lot of universities, their incentive when it comes to diversity is the number.
Yeah.
It's to say we're doing a really great job.
Yeah.
Look at our figures. But it's like, they never give the breakdown. They're not like, this is the actual percentage. This is how much money their parents make. This is where they're from. And they certainly don't go deeper and figure out what was happening in those kids' lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, Cheryl Cashin has this phrase, and she's got optical diversity,
Right.
Which she kind of uses. But if you're right, if you break it down, even if you look at the black figures in some of these, you're right, the high proportion are upper middle class or from high schools, or more recent immigrants.
Yep. Which
so
is a huge skew.
Yeah, so you're speaking to a completely different set of issues.
Which is
the ones you
another
presented.
constant tension that happens on those campuses, because you have kids who, a lot of them, I mean, when I was there, they called themselves just black, JBs. And then you had these massive number of kids who had come within this generation who were from someplace in Africa or were West Indian.
Yeah.
And they were like, I don't know why these black Americans can't get it together.
Exactly.
And it creates this massive tension, right?
Wow.
Great.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so when I talk to people, most of their concerns are about competition, and they want to be somewhat shielded. And a lot of times what I see is that basically the solution to shield people from the competition is like you have to enact policies that will cause companies to leave, like more taxes or and so basically if the companies leave, then the income goes down, so basically like the overall level goes down. So what you get is that the politicians end up doing a lot of scapegoating, so they blame this racial group, they blame if they're the left, they blame the right, if they're the right, they blame the left. And then it'll just becomes all this like jammer, but nothing actually gets done. So my question is more like, how do you impact some change and actually create policies that will create change, will make people more equal? So it's like, what's your solution in essence, or your utopia? That's my question.
I mean, I think the idea of like what the utopia would be and what is actually feasible. I mean, I think the system that you just described is the way the system is going to be for a very long time. I mean, the ideal would be that companies particularly don't have that option, right? That if one state says we're going to raise taxes for this purpose, they don't have the option of fleeing to New Jersey, fleeing right across the river, or fleeing, one state away and getting some huge incentive and then having this massive argument. I mean, the idea would be that we would all broadly accept that things are massively unequal and that something has to be done and that sacrifice will be required, and that sacrifice will likely be from not people at the top, from us, from you, from your pocket, from your profit margins, et cetera. And I think until there's some sort of broad acceptance, which to me, because I'm a journalist, I'm skeptical, that feels like utopia to me. I can't imagine a world in which that exists within a competitive capitalist market.
I can't improve on that. I can't
Sorry.
answer that. I guess I could be more optimistic. But,
Yeah, sure.
So first thing, I think it's what happens earlier, and I do have a list of fairly tepid policy proposals in my book. They're weak, but because I think in terms of, we've mentioned colleges, K-12, Arnie Duncan did a calculation that you could give a 50% pay rise to every K-12 teacher teaching in the poorest schools. You give them 50% pay rise and it costs about $10 billion a year. Now, how you'd actually make that happen as a matter of policy, I'm not even going to pretend to say. But it just makes the point. That's not much. We spend 70 billion on the mortgage interest deduction. So I'm saying if we wanted to pay good teachers teaching the poorest kids a lot more and create incentives to do that, we can do that.
Doable.
It's doable. Yeah. Why don't we? And that's the stuff that we just talked about, which is because we're in this equilibrium whereby the people who have the resources, us, are unwilling to share them because we are convinced that we deserve them. And we're so doubling down on our own self-interest and our kids' self-interest that we are hard to persuade to give up. And one of the reasons I poke at things like 529s and legacy preferences and all that is not because I think they're going to bring about structural changes we need, but because if we can't do that, we have no hope of doing anything else. Unless we change the culture within which we do. The other thing I say this to companies is stand in your own shoes, start from where you are. How do you recruit? What's your actual diversity? Are you tracking your actual diversity as well as other kinds of diversity? How do you hire your interns? What do you have take your kids to work day? That's stupid. At Brookings now we take other people's kids to work day because take your kids to work day is a class differentiation mechanism. What a stupid idea that is. And Barack Obama tried to change that. So now at Brookings we had 150 DCPS students come in. What's the point of me taking my kids to Brookings? They know what an upper middle class white professional workplace looks like. What about the kids whose parents don't work or who work in there? So just and these seem like incredibly small, trivial things, but we have to stand in our own shoes, start where we are. And do the start from there, ripple out.
So I'm just going to play off that for a second. So a thing that I do think can happen and can happen more when it comes to corporations is the demand for accountability. Already, we've seen a lot more companies feeling forced to take an actual strong stand when things happen. I mean, before it was always, we are nonpartisan, we want everybody's money, blah, 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 right? But consumers have kind of forced companies into a space where there are certain things that they feel a need to react to. There are certain things that they feel a need to do. Even when we look at, the past few weeks of sexual harassment claims. Sexual harassment claims have been coming out since companies friggin' started, right? But all of a sudden, people are feeling a need to not just respond to them, but to quickly fire people, right?
Just happened at Brookings, actually.
Right. 20 women come out and they're like, and all of a sudden, ties are cut. Because we have reached this kind of wave of public consensus where it's like, no, we will not demand it. We will not stand for it, and we will demand a change. And if you don't create that change, you risk losing our money, right? I mean, they are profit-eating entities. If you take away their profit, they will change their behavior. But that requires you changing your behavior, and that hasn't historically been great, right? You have a company that you understand has slave labor in their supply chain, but damn, their dresses are so cute and cheap, and you keep shopping there, right? Like, you're wrong. Like, it demands accountability at the personal level as well.
I could add on the internships, too, that the Koch donor network is funding tons of internships. I was just speaking to a journalist in Chicago whose son went to the American Enterprise Institute, and I believe he said they had 70 interns fully funded this summer. So I think it's also something that's going to start skewing way to the right if people in the liberal, sort of upper 20% don't start to realize that these things need to be more widely shared and more people brought in. The people who will be brought in will be trained to in the thought and policies of the right. Derek.
Great example.
So there truly are three great minds on stage, and I'm fortunate to be in the audience. But the last point that was made about proactive strategies, what if every company that receives any type of government subsidy contract, if they were subject to proactive audits similar to the studies that you cited earlier, where you proactively detect discrimination? One of the problems, I think, is we're passive and we don't proactively test it. But my question and why I'm here is stratification economics is largely about relative positioning and its impact on intergroup relationships. I'd say that the black relative position has not changed in economic terms since about the mid-1970s. And if we talk about wealth, one could argue that it has never changed post-slavery. But even with Case and Deaton's work, they tend to couch the Case and Deaton work about the mortality rises for whites that of a certain demographic that don't have high education. They couch it in terms of absolute position, precarity amongst that group. But is it a potential result or artifact of a perceived reduction in their relative positioning? Would that be a better approach to think about? And then the The last point I'll try to bring up is Gillian mentioned that CEOs, the share of black CEOs has decreased from one period to the next, and it was never high, so it was always a scenario perhaps of tokenism towards diversity. But is this encroachment on white relative position with the manifestation of Trump as the president, for example, is this now a point in time where we don't even have to give lip service to tokenism, that that the guilt is completely gone?
Interesting.
Well, shall we go at the first bit? But,
Yeah, and
I'm
I'll
sure
grab
you're
a
going to
second.
do the second. But I will just say on that, I think we're at a very dangerous moment in terms of the way we think about race and class. And I say that because I see many white liberal colleagues turning their attention to the problems of the, quotes, white working class with an enthusiasm that I think betrays the difficulty with which they have been grappling with issues of race. I think it's just much easier. And this is the criticism Gillian started, and I'm getting about my book. It's just much easier if you're white to talk about class than race. And that's both good and bad reasons, by the way. But the Case Deaton stuff, the white despair stuff, the opioid stuff is all playing into the kind of narrative, which is like, oh, we really need to worry about the whites now. Okay. What happened to the debate about black Americans? So I'm really troubled by that. It's sort of political intellectual trend. But the line that I used last night that Gillian mentioned was actually from a colleague of mine, Dana Bowen Matthew, who's now at UVA, who said, equality always feels like a loss to the people who were previously unfairly ahead. And I think every word of that sentence is powerful, unfairly ahead. So I think Gillian's right. Loss of relative status. So my view is everything's relative. Everything is, pretty much. The question is relative to what and to whom. So if you're looking back to your parents, or you're looking to other whites, or you're looking to what are you comparing yourself to? So one of the reasons why poor black Americans are optimistic by comparison to poor white Americans is because, difficult though things are, they think things will get better, right? Rightly or wrongly. What's happening now is that white Americans in the middle and bottom of the distribution have been able to be convinced that they are losing relative status when they're not. The relative gap between black and white Americans, I completely agree with you, is as it was. And in terms of wealth, has gotten worse. It's not quite as true for Asian Americans, some of the reasons we've identified. And so there's this story about relative decline. I think the only bit I would add is gender, which has been a cross-cutting theme here today. Black women are actually doing better on many measures, black men less so. And some of what we see in the reaction around automation and is about gender as well. And so it's your line about the mediocre white man, the competence of mediocre. The truth is that mediocre white men did pretty well for quite a while in the post-war years. Actually, they did pretty well. And the unions helped, excluded women and black Americans. The economy helped, the global position helped. So basically, you had a generation of pretty good times for mediocre white men. And that's less true now in various ways, without it being the case of being overtaken by black Americans. And that's why that's not an answer to your question. It's really just extending it to say that the issues of stratification, race, and relative position and how they're playing out politically now are incredibly timely. And I'm quite troubled by it for the reasons that I just identified.
Yeah. And
We're status creatures.
Let's take
Could I just,
let's take the last two questions
Okay, great.
in sequence and then let the panel.
I just have to say, too, as someone who's also a labor scholar, I think it might be very important to nuance the comment that you just made, that it's certainly true that the building trades and some of the crafts were terribly exclusive and there was discrimination in other unions, but also for African Americans, unions have been a tremendous elevator and have helped, particularly in public sector employment. And part of the reason that African Americans are getting so hard hit now is because of the devastation of the public sector and those public sector unions. So,
I completely agree. It's a good point.
Great. Okay.
Hi, my name is Sandra Conway, and I'm a public school advocate in Charlotte, North Carolina. So we have a real-life case study in that otherwise North Carolina is in the news for the wrong reasons. And so we are the worst for economic mobility, so I guess number one for dream hoarding in the country. And we have resegregated to pre-71 levels in our schools. And so starting in 2014, I worked with a lot of outstanding advocates to try to bring public will around our student assignment policies. And the silence was deafening from the power structure, in spite of the Chetty embarrassment, Charlotte hates being last, in spite of protest after Key Scott's murder. I'm a little obsessed with Bill Chafe's book, Civilities and Civil Rights, around the progressive mystique, where we pride ourselves on conversation, but when it gets to action and policy, we're often the last to act. And so, Richard, I know you've been working in Charlotte, and where do you see possibilities for policy change? Because it was so weak around student assignment, and it was one lever that really could have made a difference, and we blew right past it.
Yeah, I agree.
Great question.
Great question. Did Sandy want us to take both of them?
Oh, take them at the same time? I see.
I think
Okay.
he wanted to bracket them.
Okay.
Sorry, we're going.
Hello, I'm YM Carrington. I'm a LGBTQ activist here in the Durham, Chapel Hill area. I guess my question is, and this is coming from my own personal experience as an African American college graduate, first generation college graduate, born and raised in North Carolina and a descendant of slaves. When is this going to change? Because it's easy for me. It's easy to come to these conferences. It's easy to talk about this research. We've been doing this research for the better part of 40 to 50 years, at least since the Great Society of the 1960s. And nothing has changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. Like I'll be 40 in December, and it's gotten worse. It's gotten worse for the young adults who have come after me. We're college graduates and we don't have jobs. Like, I've lived that experience, and it's not getting any better. Some of us have master's degrees and we don't have jobs, and I don't see it changing. And it's because not only are we black, are we descendants of slaves, but we're at the intersection of being transgender, lesbian, gay, gender nonconforming. And we come from poor families, and it makes it worse. When you come from poverty in Charlotte, when you come from poverty in Raleigh, as I do, when you come from poverty in Eastern North Carolina or other parts of the South, it's hard to get out of it, and I don't see it changing. And I would like to ask everyone in here, what are you doing about race and class and gender-based inequality? If you're hiring at Duke University, if you're hiring in your school systems or at your universities, what are you doing about this inequality? What are y'all doing about the fact that some of us don't have jobs and we're more than qualified? So that's just my question. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Powerful question to end on.
Do you want to go?
Oh, I was going to actually take that one.
And maybe Derek's as well.
Oh, yeah, I
Before
didn't
the
answer that
status
one.
one.
I'll get there.
Sorry.
I mean, so the thing that I would say about that, and the one thing that gives me some level of hope, because I feel like a few months ago I would have said, never. But I would say the one thing that gives me hope in Trump's America is, I've always been a person who said that in America, everything would need to get burned to the ground and be rebuilt for things to change, and for there to be an actual reckoning with what this country is, how it was built, and the systems of inequity. I don't know that we're not seeing it get burned to the ground right now. And the thing that I would say is, the crappy thing is that so many people who have suffered for so long, who have seen this, I talked to my dad, who is the consummate optimist, who grew up in Indianapolis, saw lots of Klansmen, lived through segregation, and then was in the first integrated class at Dartmouth. He's forever the world's biggest optimist about race. He's always like, look at you, look at your brother. And he is not like that anymore. He's like, I don't understand how we got to this place, how I got to this place, and hoarded all this stuff, gave it to you and your brother, and this is where we are.
Yeah.
And I don't know that he's going to see things get better in his lifetime, and that is heartbreaking. What I do think is that it's possible that we have reached such a level of crazy inflection that a lot of people who before were comfortable to say, this is not my problem, or I don't need to be uncomfortable, are now like, well, crap. We got it. We have to band together to do this, right? So I think in the next 100 years.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, that's what I got for on the CEO question. I mean, this is a thing that we talk about a lot with diversity and the issue of tokenism. And everyone that I talk to on the issue of why has this diversity trend in the uppermost levels of management gone downward, people think it's for a couple reasons, right? There's the idea that the people, the Ken Chenaults of the world who made it to the CEO level, that was actually the manifestation of the work that was done in the 60s and the 70s, right? That was actually the manifestation of those attempts, small as they were, at labor and educational equality. And they hit it, right? They reached level 10. So that's what we saw, but after that, what were the big continuing forcible movements? There was no pressure after that in the same way that would cause the next wave and the next wave and the next wave to kind of fill that pipeline up. So there's that issue, which is compounded by the issue of the fact that it's, what did you call it, optical diversity?
Optical diversity, yeah. It's Cheryl Cashin's
Right,
phrase,
so
yeah.
you see black people, at one time there were 7 black CEOs in the Fortune 500. They made up a whopping 2.4%. Did great. But you see them, and people are like, well, look at us.
And a black president.
Right, and they're like, well, we solved that problem,
Yeah, tick.
crushed it. And then there's no work being done. Like, no one says, okay, so who are the people who are 1 step away from CEO, 2 steps, 3 steps, 5 steps? And then you look at that pool, and that is less than 2% people of color. Or sorry, that's less than 2% black, less than 5% Hispanic and African American, right? So nobody looks at that pipeline and says, well, right now, we don't have the setup to have another CEO of color for the next 20 years, right? No one says that. And then no one at the rung underneath that who is a person of color is getting mentored by anyone at those upper echelons who are mostly white men, because they don't look like them and they don't understand them. So those people, instead of kind of just sticking it out and trying to rise up the ranks, are like, I don't have any mentors. No one here seems to want me here, so I'm gonna leave. So, okay, take away the next 20 to 30 years of potential CEOs, right? So I think that's part of the problem. And then I think this issue of who do we need to be most worried about in American society right now plays into it, right? Because before it was like the people that we need to be worried about are the people who have been historically discriminated against. We need to be worried about black people. We need to be worried about Hispanic people. We need to be worried about LGBT people. Like, these are the people we need to be worried about women. These are all the people we need to be worried about. And now, all of a sudden, with Trump's election, people are like, oh, you guys are hurting. We didn't know. Let's completely pivot our attention over here. And I mean, that's easier, right? Because they look like the people who are already in power. The people in power understand them. And I mean, I call it, and this is unfair because I don't know J.D. Vance, but I call it a little bit the J.D. Vance effect. Who would you rather, if you are a white person who is affluent and the head of a company, who would you rather be inviting to lunch? J.D. Vance or some young black kid from Brooklyn? You're going to pick J.D. Vance every time. And now that you can feel better about picking him, because you're like, oh, him and people like him have been so disenfranchised, people are just going to do that again and again and again. So again, not optimistic. Sorry.
So I think it would be better if there were more people like J.D. Vance who were rising up, who are from really poor, very, very, very disadvantaged backgrounds, as well as people of color. So I think, I do think we should be striving for both.
Yep.
I would say, look, there is a more optimistic way we could tell this story about lesbian and gay rights, for example, around marriage and around some of the moves that have been made around discrimination and so on. You can say there's a long way to go. But I think the way I would frame this, and I'll come back to the question from Charlotte, I think, is so the arc doesn't bend towards justice on its own. And I think that my sense is, and again, this is kind of the new America, my sense is that throughout, probably up until the end of the last century, there's this kind of sense of that things were getting better, too slowly, but the race gaps seemed to be dropping. There was movement, right? So we had to just wait it out, in a sense, that things were going the right way, albeit too slowly. And the sort of basic political economy, combined with strong moves against discrimination, we're going to, over time, we're going to generate the kind of inequality. That's not true. That's not true anymore. I think maybe the turn of the century, so the lines just flat, they just go flat. And we didn't see, because you had Obama, and because of the 2.4% of executives and people like Gillian, we can sort of say, well, look at us, go, what was he crushed it, crushed it, tick that box. And if anything, this crazy inflection, as Gillian should at least, I think, draw our attention to the fact that this has to be intentional.
Right.
There are no natural processes at work, particularly that are going to overcome the problems of race and racism, and specifically anti-black racism, and specifically anti-descendant of slave black racism. That is not going to solve itself. That is not going to, as a result of liberal moves and market growth, it's not going to happen. It's not happening. It's not going to happen. It has to be intentional. And this is a sort of change. I think I've changed my mind on this too. And that these changes come about as a result of recognizing it's a problem and intentionally bending it. Rather than just waiting for good things to happen. So to the extent that maybe it could draw attention to that, that's great. We've said how worried we are about the attention now going to the white working class, and it's kind of an obvious point to make, but the difference between choose your drug epidemic as to whether it's a crime crisis or a public health crisis depends whether you're white or black. And so I do sort of, I don't want to appear ungenerous to the problems that people are having, but what it means is that for those of us who are white, and those of us who are upper middle class and who are in positions of any kind of influence, and every single one of us is in a position of influence, whether we know it or not, have to get personal about this stuff. And this gets back to the Charlotte point, which is we'll have to give some stuff up. We'll have to fight. We'll have to fight on other people's behalf. It is incumbent on those who are in positions of the greatest privilege, and I include myself on pretty much every dimension in that, to be intentional and fight. Because we cannot just sit back and say, well, that's your problem, or it's going to solve itself, or whatever. And so whilst it's easy to sort of caricature some of the movements around this, I do think that start where we are, in our own institutions, our own lives, our own schools, our own communities, in Charlotte, where I agree there was just this huge missed opportunity to do school reassignment because the political culture even there wasn't able to accommodate it, because there were too many upper middle class people, mostly white people, who might have voted the right way. In fact, most of them probably did. How do they act? How do they act? And I think that liberalism, defined in the US sense, has been too easily subcontracted to where you put your checkbox, where you vote, who you support, what you read, your views about certain issues over the dinner table, and it's not intimate enough. It's not hard enough. It's not in our schools and our daily lives. And I'm not saying we don't want all the policies as well, but to put it very at its strongest, too many liberal white Americans are content in their liberalism and with their votes and their enlightened attitudes and all of that. But when it comes to it, when it comes to giving something up, when it comes to fighting, when it comes to paying more, when it comes to your school being desegregated, when it comes to that stuff, what happens to their liberalism then? When it comes to the vote about zoning, homeless shelter or low-income housing, when it comes to that, where are they then? And so my critique of white, upper middle class American liberals, which started with 529 and goes all the way through it, which is if you really want to share the American dream, if you're serious about your liberalism, you're going to have to get your hands dirty. And this is going to hurt. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because people have been telling that to you forever. This is going to hurt. You have to give some stuff up. And the pain is necessary, because justice demands it. But we are a very long way from that right now.
Thank you.